Welcome to Creepy Whispers. I'm Jack Thompson, and here we'll explore stories that will send chills down your spine. Get ready to dive into the unknown, where each whisper hides a secret. First story. You know when you think you've taken an important step in life, but end up stumbling into something much bigger than you imagined. That's exactly what happened to me. At 29, I thought I was fulfilling my dream of owning a house. An old two-story building on the outskirts of town, with a spacious yard and a basement I already imagined turning into a cool office. I thought it was the beginning of a new phase, you know? Me, a young teacher, finally leaving rent behind and having my own place. Little did I know that this seemingly innocent decision would drag me into a story that seemed straight out of a suspense movie, the kind we watch thinking it'll never happen in real life. At first, everything seemed normal. I mean, except for that weird feeling of being watched all the time. You know how it is, right? You move to a new place and get a bit paranoid, thinking everyone's eyeing you. But gradually, I realized it wasn't just in my head. There was a neighbor, Mr. Parker, a very old man, must have been in his 70s, who couldn't take his eyes off my house. Every time I went out to the yard or came home from work, there he was, staring at me from his window with a look that gave me chills. And it didn't stop there. Out of nowhere, he'd start appearing in my yard as if he'd sprouted from the ground. He kept bombarding me with questions about the house, wanting to know every detail, especially about the basement. Mr. Parker's obsession with the basement started to intrigue me. Like, why the basement of all places? It was just a dusty space full of junk the previous owner had left behind. But the way the old man talked, it seemed like there was gold hidden down there or something. After 2 weeks of enduring that fixed gaze and endless questions, I decided it was time to investigate the space more thoroughly. On a Friday night, after finishing grading some tests, I decided to go down to the basement with a flashlight. The place was bigger than I remembered, full of old boxes and furniture covered with sheets. I started rummaging through everything, kind of expecting to find, I don't know, a treasure chest or something. That's when I noticed something strange on one of the walls. Behind some dusty shelves, there was a piece of wall that looked different. I pushed the shelves aside and man, I almost fell backwards. It was a door. A camouflage door I had never noticed before. I tried to open it, but it was locked. At that moment, I felt a chill down my spine. It was like I had discovered a secret I shouldn't have, you know? The next day, I couldn't stand the curiosity. Early on, I called a locksmith that a colleague had recommended. The guy arrived a couple of hours later, and I was a bundle of nerves. I explained that I had found a locked door in the basement and wanted to open it. The locksmith looked at me a bit suspiciously, but didn't ask many questions. What I saw inside left me speechless. It was a small room, barely enough for 2 people to stand in. But what shocked me were the things inside it. There were a bunch of old objects scattered around. Black and white photos, old toys, some yellowed children's clothes. It seemed like time had stopped in there. With trembling hands, I picked up one of the photos. I almost dropped it when I recognized who was in the image. It was Mr. Parker, only much younger, hugging a woman and a little boy. I started rummaging through the rest of the things and found some diaries. I leafed through one of them and my stomach churned. There were a bunch of notes about a missing boy, Mr. Parker's son. The dates were from decades ago. I stayed there for a long time, leafing through the diaries and looking at the photos, trying to piece together that crazy puzzle. My head was spinning, thinking of 1,000 different theories. Had Mr. Parker's son disappeared in this house? Or worse, had something more sinister happened? I was so absorbed in it all that I didn't even notice the time passing. The next day, I was having breakfast in the kitchen when I heard some loud knocks on the door. I opened it and came face to face with Mr. Parker. Man, I had never seen him like that. His eyes were wide, his face red with anger. Before I could say anything, he started yelling, accusing me of having entered the hidden room. After that confrontation at the door, things got even stranger. Mr. Parker started appearing at random times, sometimes in the middle of the night, banging on my door and demanding to enter. He said he needed to look for his son, that I was hiding something. There was one time I woke up at a.m. to the sound of him trying to force the living room window. I started living in a constant state of alert. I couldn't sleep properly anymore, always waiting for Mr. Parker's next outburst. At work, I was a wreck. My students started asking if I was sick because I looked like a zombie. I thought about telling someone about the hidden room and the old man's accusations, but who would believe me? The situation was becoming increasingly unbearable. Mr. Parker seemed to be everywhere. When I left for work, there he was watching me. When I returned, I found signs that someone had tried to enter the house. Once, I came home and found the basement door broken into. I ran down, my heart in my mouth, and saw that the secret room had been ransacked. I decided I needed to confront Mr. Parker once and for all. On a Saturday afternoon, I mustered up the courage and went to his house. I rang the doorbell, my hands cold with sweat. When he opened the door, I started talking all at once. I told him about finding the room, about the photos, the diaries, asked what had happened to his son. Mr. Parker told me a story that chilled my blood. Over 40 years ago, his 8-year-old son had mysteriously disappeared from the house, the same house where I was living now. He and his wife looked everywhere, called the police, searched the neighborhood, but the boy had simply vanished. Over time, the searches diminished, people forgot, but Mr. Parker never gave up. When I bought the house, all the memories and pain came rushing back. He started watching me, hoping to see some sign, some clue that could reveal the mystery. The hidden room was where he kept all the memories of his son, a place that even the police hadn't found at the time. Seeing that I had discovered that space made him panic. That night, I went back home with my head spinning. All the anger and fear I felt towards Mr. Parker had turned into deep compassion. I realized that this house, which I thought would be the beginning of a new life, actually carried a story of pain and mystery that I could never have imagined. Second story, I never thought my life would change so much in just one day. It all started when my wife Sarah and I moved into an old house in rural New Mexico. We were super excited about the move, you know. It was our first home, and we couldn't wait to start this new chapter. The place was much bigger than our old apartment in the city, and the price was great for the area. Sure, it needed some renovations here and there, but nothing I couldn't handle as an electrician. The house was somewhat isolated, surrounded by a large plot of land, which gave us a sense of privacy we'd never had before. On the first day, we were unpacking and exploring every corner of the house. That's when I decided to check out the basement to see what needed to be done with the electrical work. I went down the creaky basement stairs with my toolbox, turning on my phone's flashlight to see better. The place was a mess, full of old junk from the previous owners. As I walked through the cramped space, something caught my eye in the farthest corner. It was a metal door, one of those heavy bank vault types, you know? I thought it was super weird to have a door like that in a house basement. I tried to open it, but it was locked. I called Sarah to see it, and she was just as intrigued as I was. We spent a long time speculating about what could be inside. Was it a safe? Or maybe a Cold War-era bomb shelter? Our imagination was running wild. I spent the whole afternoon trying to open the damn door. I tried everything. Old keys we found around the house, a crowbar lying in the basement, even YouTube videos on how to pick locks. Not proud of that, but curiosity was killing me. Nothing worked. Sarah kept teasing me, saying I was obsessed, but I could tell she was just as curious as I was. Around 6 in the evening, when I was about to give up, I heard a strange noise coming from behind the door. It was very faint, like someone had dropped something on the floor. I froze, my heart in my throat. Was there someone in there? Or was it just the old house making noise? I called Sarah in a whisper and told her what I'd heard. We stood there, silent, trying to hear more. Nothing. Just the heavy silence of the basement. But then, out of nowhere, we heard it again. This time it was clearer, like someone was dragging something heavy. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. We looked at each other, not knowing what to do. My first instinct was to shout, ask if anyone was there, but Sarah stopped me. What if it was an intruder? We didn't even know the neighborhood yet, didn't know if we could trust anyone around here. We decided to go upstairs and call the police. Better safe than sorry, right? While we waited for the police to arrive, we stayed upstairs, nervously glancing at the basement door every 2 seconds. Sarah was shaking, and I have to admit, I wasn't much better. The wait felt like an eternity. Every little noise in the house made me jump. Was there really someone down there? And if so, how the hell did they get in? We started thinking of all the crazy possibilities. What if it was a fugitive hiding out? Or worse, what if the house had been used for something illegal before we bought it? After what seemed like a lifetime, we finally heard sirens approaching. 2 police officers arrived, an older guy and a young woman. I explained the situation to them, feeling kind of stupid. I mean, we had just moved in and were already causing trouble in the neighborhood. The officers listened to the whole story, exchanged looks I couldn't interpret, and asked to see the basement. We all went down together, me in front with the flashlight. I showed them the metal door and explained about the noises. The officers examined everything carefully. They knocked on the door, called out, but nothing happened. They tried to open the door too, without success. That's when the older officer noticed something we had missed. There were marks on the floor, as if the door had been opened recently. The officers decided they needed to open that door no matter what. They called an emergency locksmith, and while we waited, asked more questions about the house, the previous owners, if we had noticed anything else strange. Honestly, I was already regretting calling them. It all seemed crazy, you know. We just wanted to start a new life in that house, and now we were in the middle of all this mess. The locksmith arrived about 40 minutes later, all out of breath, as if he'd run a marathon. He started working on the lock while we all watched in silence. The guy was good, I'll tell you that. In less than 15 minutes, we heard that click indicating the door had been unlocked. My heart was racing. The officers asked us to stay back while they slowly opened the door, hands on their weapons. The door opened with a creak that seemed straight out of a horror movie. And man, nothing could have prepared me for what we saw in there. It was a room. A small room, but completely furnished, and worst of all, it looked like it had been used recently. There was an unmade single bed, a small table with an old laptop, some clothes thrown on the floor, and the weirdest thing, leftover food on plates piled in a corner. The smell was a mix of mold and spoiled food. I stood paralyzed at the entrance, trying to process what I was seeing. How could there be a hidden room in the basement of our new house? And more importantly, who the hell had been living there? The officers entered carefully, searching every corner of the room. The younger officer found something that made my blood run cold. A camouflage door on the opposite wall. It led to the outside of the house. This door was unlocked. That's when it hit me. Someone had been using this room as some kind of hideout, coming and going without anyone noticing. I looked at Sarah and saw the panic in her eyes. Our house, which was supposed to be our refuge, suddenly seemed like the most unsafe place in the world. The officers started taking pictures of everything, saying they were going to open an investigation. They assured us they would increase patrols in the area. But honestly, that didn't make me feel any better at all. After the police left, Sarah and I just stood there in the middle of the living room, not knowing what to do. The house that a few hours ago had seemed like a dream come true now gave us the creeps. We decided to lock all the doors and windows tightly, including the damn basement door. Neither of us could think about sleeping. We stayed up all night, sitting on the living room sofa, jumping at every little noise. Around 3 in the morning, when I was almost dozing off, we heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone walking on the gravel in the garden. My heart started racing immediately. I jumped up, grabbing the baseball bat we had set aside earlier, just in case, you know. Sarah grabbed her phone, ready to call 911 again. We stood there, silent, listening. The footsteps seemed to be approaching the house. Then, out of nowhere, we heard the sound of someone trying to open the back door. Man, I've never felt so scared in my life. Sarah started crying softly while I approached the door, holding the bat so tight, my knuckles turned white. The noise at the door continued for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. And then, silence. Complete silence. I stood there, bat in hand, staring at the back door. My mind was racing. Had the person given up? Or were they just waiting for us to let our guard down? Sarah whispered for me not to open the door under any circumstances. She didn't need to tell me. I wasn't going to risk it. We stayed in that tension for a good while, until I worked up the courage to look out the window. I couldn't see anything in the dark, just the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. When the sun finally started to rise, we felt a little safer to take a look outside. I opened the door slowly, still holding the bat, and walked around the house. There was no one there, but I found something that chilled me to the bone. Footprints in the dirt near the back door. Someone really had been there. I ran back inside and told Sarah. We decided right then and there we couldn't stay in that house for another minute. We packed some clothes and important things in a suitcase and got out of there as fast as we could. On the way to the car, I noticed that the camouflaged basement door, the one that led outside, was ajar. I'm sure the police had closed it the night before. We spent the next few days in a cheap hotel in town, trying to process everything that had happened. The police continued investigating, but they didn't find much. Apparently, the room had been used for a long time, but there was no concrete evidence about who the intruder was. They found some fingerprints, but they didn't match anything in their system. The laptop was password protected and was taken for forensic analysis. To this day, I don't know if they discovered anything. We ended up giving up on the house. I know it might seem hasty, but after that night, the idea of going back there gave me chills. We managed to sell the property for less than we paid, telling the whole story to the new buyer, of course. I think the guy was a bit crazy, because he seemed more excited than scared about all this. Anyway, it's been a few months since all this happened, and we're living in a small apartment again. Sometimes, when it's all quiet at night, I still think about that house, that hidden room. Who was that person? Why were they hiding there? And do they still go back there from time to time without anyone noticing? These are questions that will probably never be answered, and maybe that's for the best. But one thing I learned, sometimes the secrets hidden within four walls are scarier than any horror story. Third story, my name is Mason, And what I'm about to tell you is so surreal that I sometimes wonder if it really happened. It all started about 3 months ago when I fulfilled my dream of buying my first house. It was a simple place, but perfect for me. 2 bedrooms, a small yard, and a seemingly quiet neighborhood. For the first few days, I was completely focused on turning that space into my home. I spent all my time arranging things, hanging pictures, and doing small repairs. I was so absorbed in my new routine that I barely paid attention to what was happening around me. It wasn't until a week later that I started noticing something unusual. Every time I left for work or came home, I saw an Asian lady standing at the window of the house next door, watching me. At first, I thought it was just curiosity about the new neighbor, I even waved a few times, trying to be friendly. But she never returned the gesture. She just stood there, motionless, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. It was as if her eyes followed me wherever I went in the yard. It started to make me feel uncomfortable, but I tried not to think too much about it. Things started to get stranger the following week. One day, as I was leaving for work, I found a plant pot on my porch. It wasn't mine, and it certainly wasn't there the night before. It was a simple pot with a plant I didn't recognize, with dark, twisted leaves. I was confused, but thought it might be a welcome gift from a neighbor. I decided to leave it there and thank them later if I found out who had left it. But something about that plant bothered me. The leaves seemed, I don't know, too alive? It's hard to explain, but it gave the impression that they moved on their own, even without wind. The next day, things got even weirder. I woke up early to go for a run, as I always do, and when I opened the front door, I almost stepped on something. It was a small package covered with a red cloth. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. When I opened it, my stomach turned. Inside was what appeared to be a cloth doll, all twisted and with pins stuck in it. I'm not superstitious, but it gave me chills. I looked around, trying to see who could have left it there, and that's when I saw her. The Asian lady was at the window, watching me as always. But this time, she had a smile on her face. A smile that made my blood run cold. That night, I couldn't sleep a wink. I kept thinking about the doll, the strange plant, and that disturbing smile from my neighbor. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that maybe she was just a lonely old lady trying to make friends in a weird way. But a little voice in the back of my head kept screaming that something wasn't right. I tossed and turned in bed, sweating, imagining what might happen next. When the sun began to rise, I decided I needed to do something. I thought about talking to other neighbors. Maybe they knew something about the Asian lady that could help me understand what was going on. I left the house around a.m., determined to talk to someone. That's when I noticed something different in my yard. There were marks on the grass, as if someone had dragged something heavy. I followed the marks with my eyes, and my heart almost stopped. In the corner of the yard, near the fence that divided my house from the neighbors, there was a circle made of what appeared to be small bones. In the center of the circle was a photo of me, a photo that I was sure was inside my house, in a frame in the living room. I stood paralyzed, not knowing what to do. How did that get there? How had someone entered my house without me noticing? At that moment, I realized I could no longer ignore what was happening. I ran inside the house, locked all the doors and windows, and called my friend Jake. He's a cop, and I thought he could help me. While waiting for Jake to arrive, I kept looking out the window, trying to see any movement in the neighbor's house. Time seemed to drag on. Each minute felt like an eternity. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from the back of the house. It sounded like someone was trying to open the kitchen door. My heart raced. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and slowly made my way to the kitchen, trying not to make any noise. When I got near the door, the noise stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, the bat firm in my hands. Then, out of nowhere, the doorknob started to turn. My blood ran cold. The door opened slowly, and to my horror, I saw the Asian lady entering my kitchen. She was holding something in her hand. It looked like a knife. Her eyes met mine, and that disturbing smile appeared again. She said something in a language I didn't understand and started coming towards me. I screamed, raised the bat, ready to defend myself. That's when I heard sirens approaching. The neighbor seemed to hesitate for a moment, looked outside, and then ran back to the yard. I stood paralyzed for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. The sirens were getting louder, and soon I heard loud knocks on the front door. It was Jake shouting my name. I ran to open it, my hands shaking so much I could barely turn the key. When I finally opened it, Jake rushed in, gun in hand, asking what was going on. I could barely speak, the words tumbling out as I tried to explain about the neighbor, the doll, the bones in the yard, and the kitchen invasion. Jake looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief, but when he saw my state, he realized I wasn't making it up. As Jake called for backup on the radio, we heard a noise coming from the neighbor's yard. We ran to the window and saw the Asian lady dragging what appeared to be a large, heavy bag towards the back of her house. Jake immediately went out, ordering me to stay inside. I stayed glued to the window, watching Jake cautiously approach the fence. He shouted something at the lady, who suddenly stopped. She turned slowly, still holding the bag. What happened next was so fast, I could hardly believe it. The lady dropped the bag and, in a movement too agile for someone her age, jumped the fence and started running towards me, the knife raised in the air. My body reacted before my brain could process what was happening. I ran to lock the door, but my hands were shaking so much I couldn't get the key in. I heard Jake shouting and the lady's footsteps rapidly approaching. At the last second, I managed to lock the door. At the same instant, I felt a strong thud on the other side. The lady had crashed into the door. I backed away, horrified, as I watched the doorknob turning frantically. Jake arrived shortly after, gun pointed, shouting orders for the lady to back off. But she seemed to be in a trance, still trying to get in, muttering words I couldn't understand. Everything that happened after that seems like a blur in my memory. More police arrived, surrounding the house. The lady finally backed away from the door, but not before looking at me through the window. That look, I'll never forget it. It wasn't anger nor madness. It was something deeper, more disturbing. As if she knew something about me, something I didn't even know myself. The police immobilized her and took her away. Jake stayed with me, asking questions, taking my statement. In the weeks that followed, the police investigated everything. They discovered things in the lady's house that gave me chills just hearing about them. Apparently, she had a history of obsessive behavior with neighbors in other places where she had lived. They found a bizarre altar in her basement with photos of me and other people, black candles, strange symbols drawn on the walls. The bones in my yard, they were from small animals. The strange plant, a rare species known for its supposed hallucinogenic properties. As for the bag she was dragging, it was full of soil, herbs, and more animal bones. The police said it looked like some kind of ritual. 3 months have passed since that day, and I still can't sleep properly. I ended up moving. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I heard something, as if someone was watching me. The doctors say it's post-traumatic stress, that it will pass with time. But there's one thing I can't get out of my head. Why me? What did that lady see in me that made her act that way? And the scariest part, what if she wasn't alone in this? What if there are other people like her out there, choosing their victims for reasons we can't understand? I know it sounds crazy, but after what I've been through, I've learned that reality can be much stranger and scarier than any fiction.